Hello, this is Unit 2, Lesson 2.2. What did the Constitution say about slavery? Your learning intention and success criteria today. Today, we're learning how to analyze and interpret primary sources so that we can better understand how the U.S. Constitution addressed the issue of slavery. You need to be able to do two things as part of your success criteria. One, you need to be able to read and analyze various parts of the Constitution and explain how they specifically address slavery. And then you need to be able to analyze the ethics involved in Roger Sherman's efforts to compromise on the issue of slavery. You're going to learn more about him in a little bit. So if you have not already done so, usually at the beginning of class, I run through the mini lecture that kind of introduces the lesson. If you haven't checked that out yet, it should be linked to this assignment in Google Classroom. So check it out. So your document today is actually twofold. Let's see, maybe it should go that way. Where it has three sections of the Constitution, and I ask you to kind of explain and summarize in your own words for each one of them. So this was written in 1787. This is our current Constitution. We had one before called the Articles of Confederation, but that's not something we're going to be talking about today. But the first one on the front page is Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. And it says, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this union according to their respected numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, and 3/5 of all other persons. Now, again, this is 1787 language, so sometimes this is really, really hard to kind of figure out in the modern world. But basically what this is saying is that the way that we're going to choose representatives and determine how many representatives each state should have is going to be based upon a state's population, at least in the House of Representatives. So we're going to add a couple of things here. We're going to add free people. That would be normal citizens that are, everyday citizens, men really in this case. And we're going to include people that are bound to service for a term of years. Basically, indentured servants are what they're talking about. People that agreed to kind of work for a certain amount of time in exchange for either pay, travel to the New World, or in exchange for something, but they have to continue serving or have to continue working until the end of their term. Excluding, meaning not this number is not going to include Indians that are not being taxed, and then 3/5 of all other persons. That 3/5 is really, really going to be important because he's talking about, or the Constitution is talking about slaves in this case. There's a huge argument back when the Constitution was being written. States that had large slave populations like Virginia, they wanted slaves to be counted towards their population because then they would have more representatives in government. If you take away the number of slaves, or if you don't count the slaves, the population of states like Virginia would pretty much drop in half, maybe even a little bit more than that. So there was an incentive to count slaves in those states because there were a huge number of them, and the more people that you had, the more representatives and more power you had in this new government that they were creating. So states in the North that really didn't like that plan, well, if their view was pretty much, well, if those people are not good enough to be counted as citizens, equal citizens, then they're really not good enough to be counted, in terms of population. You can't have it both ways. Either these slaves, are going to be counted as citizens with equal rights, or they're not. You can't have it both ways. So they argued back and forth, and eventually they came up with this thing called the 3/5 compromise, where slaves in those states would be counted as 3/5 of a person when it came to counting for population for representation. So 3 out of 5 slaves would be counted as towards the population, and that seems to be the happy compromise, at least for the people that were making the decision, I suppose. All right. The next one, which is Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1. Again, Article 1 is what deals with Congress. And it says the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on each or such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person. So this is more or less saying that in the year 1000 or 1808, roughly 20 years from the time the Constitution was written, we're going to start taxing these slaves if you are still wanting to bring them in. It's their way of kind of kicking the can down the road, so to speak, where we don't want to address the problem of slavery today because we will never agree on it, whether to get rid of it or not. But we'll kick the can down the road, kick it down 20 years and let our children and grandchildren try to figure out this problem. That way we don't get in too much trouble. All right, the last one is Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3. No person held to service or labor, slavery, in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on the claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. This is important because keep in mind that as soon as the Constitution was written, even before then, we have slave states and non-slave states. We have slave states like Virginia, in the South that want to continue slavery, but then we have states that don't want slavery, like New York and states that were more in the North. And then the question needed to be answered: well, what happens if a slave escapes a plantation in Virginia and somehow makes his or her way all the way up to New York? And then is captured. So does New York have a responsibility for returning that slave back to Virginia? Or if you make it across the line, can you just stop and wave, across back over the border saying, ha ha, I made it across, you can't catch me anymore. So our founding fathers needed to address this question. And the way they decided to address it was, if you are able to escape your plantation and make it to the North, technically the North is supposed to return you back to your rightful owner in the South, even if they themselves don't agree with slavery. So what is really kind of funny, if you reread all three of these portions of the Constitution, you might notice that the word slave or slavery doesn't appear once. They use other words like servitude and things of that nature, or, in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, they just say 3/5 of all other persons, as they kind of talk about everyone else that they haven't already talked about. So you might want to keep that in mind. If you have any questions about the document, let me know. I'll be walking around the classroom. Otherwise, there's a couple of critical thinking questions. I really encourage you to kind of read through that with a partner, maybe even a group of 3, to make sure that you guys understand it. And then there's a reflection question about Roger Sherman that I think you might find very interesting. So let me know what you think. And if you have any questions, I'll be around.